Over on the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to find the toolbox. Toolbox is a very important piece of the user interface that we're going to be referring back to very often. So let's go over a few of these tools. The very first one we have here at the very top is our select tool, that icon of an arrow. That's going to simply allow us to select and deselect multiple objects inside our scene. So if I create a polygon cylinder and click on my select tool, I'll just simply be able to select between these two objects. I can also click and drag and make a square marquee to select these two objects inside my scene. The next tool that we have is the lasso select tool. So this allows me to simply make a draw selection over multiple objects or components inside my scene. So for instance, I can select these two objects, or if I select some of the vertices on this polygon sphere, I can click and drag and make a little bit more of an interactive selection of the surface that I'm trying to select versus the first tool, the select tool, which allows us to just click and drag and make these square selections around objects or components. The next tool that we're looking at is new to Maya 8, which is the Paint Select tool. Now this used to be found under the Edit menu, under Edit Paint Select tool, but now it's been such a useful tool they put it here in the toolbox. So we're going to click on Paint Select. Now Paint Select is done in component mode, so the individual pieces that we're going to work with here on our sphere. So right now if I right click on the sphere and select faces, I can simply paint the selection that I want to work with. This is a very, very quick way to select the different components that you're interested in using. Now if I double click on the Paint Select tool, we're going to get an option box show up. And inside this option box we have the ability to click Select, which obviously will add faces to my selection. Or I can click Toggle, which will do this. Any face that is unselected right now will be selected, and anything that was selected will now be unselected. Or we can just simply click Unselect, and it will just unselect everything that we've now selected on this polygon sphere as far as the faces. There are a few radius sizes that we can change up here to change the shape of our brush, or we can hold down the letter B and left mouse button click and drag to interactively change, which is something I much prefer to do. It's much faster to do that. So the letter B, left mouse button, and then slide back and forth will change your brush size. So we'll close that down. The next tool that we're looking at is the Move tool. So I'm going to jump back into object mode for this sphere. And you'll notice when I click on the Move tool, which is the cone with a little slash arrow, we get these arrows inside our scene. And if that's difficult for you to see on your screen, I'm simply going to hit the plus key. And you'll notice that that manipulator grows in size. And I can click on the tips of the arrows to move my object in that specific axis. So right now I'm moving it up in Y, or moving it back and forth in X, or back and forth in Z. Now if I click in the center of all of these arrows where they meet in the center of this object, I can free move this based on how I'm looking at it. This is a very inaccurate way of moving objects around your scene, but it's also a very quick way to grab and move things around instead of having to use the arrows to keep constraint to specific axes. Underneath the Move tool we have the Rotate tool. If I click on that, we'll get these rings. Now this is a little bit large and it kind of encompasses my cylinder over here, so I'm going to hit minus to shrink down that manipulator a little bit. So plus to grow the size of your manipulator, and minus to shrink it down. So you'll notice with these rings I can click directly on the colored rings to again rotate in that constrained axis. I can rotate in the x-axis, y, or z. But you notice that we do have a fourth ring sitting on the outside, which is always facing me. It's this blue ring that I see facing directly towards the camera. That will rotate your object based on how you're facing it. So for instance, if I were to move my camera and look down on my object, you'll notice that this ring on the outside, which is now yellow, can be rotated, and it will rotate the object based on wherever I'm looking at the object. Next we have the Scale tool, which is the icon of the cube. When I click on that, of course, we will get cubes sticking out of our center object here. These cube manipulators will allow me to click and drag to change the shape of this object. And of course, we're changing the shape in this constrained axis. So right now I'm scaling it up in Y. This would be scaling in X, and of course scaling in Z. Now you'll notice that there is a cube sitting directly in the center. So if I click and move left and right with my mouse, we can scale up in all directions proportionally at the same time. Underneath the scale tool, we have the universal manipulator. Now again, this was created in, I think, Maya 7, which basically takes these last three tools, the move, the rotate, and the scale, and sticks them all together in one manipulator. So I'll click on that and simply click on this cylinder. And you notice we get a lot of things going on here, and it looks a little bit busy at first, but it's actually fairly simple. You'll notice that we do have our move manipulators to move our objects. And you'll notice on this bounding box around this object, we do have these kind of rotate arrows. You can click and drag and rotate the object around that specific axis. We also have these little blue cubes in the corners of the bounding box that we can click, and then whatever direction we move in will be the direction we scale in. Now there is something inside this option box that I would like to show you, so I'll double click on the universal manipulator tool, and that'll bring up its options. And I'd like to look at this area here that says rotate around either center or pivot. Right now it's set to pivot. In case you're new to Maya, the pivot point is basically the center of your object. You'll notice that my move manipulator is located directly in the center of my object's pivot. So if I set this to center, rotate around center, you'll notice that when I rotate this, it's rotating around the edge adjacent to that rotate manipulator that I grabbed. It's kind of like as if we stuck a hinge right here in the corner and we're watching it rotate around that hinge. Versus if I switch back to pivot, we're rotating around the pivot of the actual object. The next tool in our toolbox is a soft modification tool. So let's go back to a polygon sphere to demonstrate this. Now, with my sphere actually unselected, I'm going to click on the soft modification tool. I'm then going to click on an area here on the sphere. And the minute you do that, you're going to notice that you get this little tiny S show up. You're also going to get this very interesting color combination. And what this is showing us is the fall off effect of the soft modification tool. I can then grab this and move it and pull it out, and you can see that it's having a very high level of influence over this yellow bright area and not so much influence off these darker areas here. So if I click on another area on this polysphere, it'll automatically create a new soft modification, which I could then pull out and stretch. So it's a very quick way to take these polygons, which can be very faceted, and quickly model it and reshape it with this nice soft modification. Now if I double click on the soft modification tool, you're going to get a fall off radius and several other options that you can adjust and play with. But if I take this fall off radius and I turn it way down, so I'm going to turn it down to about 2, and then click on another area of the sphere, you notice that our fall off is obviously much more localized. And it's going to have a much more local effect. Versus if I turn this up to something around 14 and then click on the object, we'll have a much greater effect on what we're doing. Now if I close down this menu and open up the channel box, which is the icon located at the very top right hand part of my screen, you'll notice under outputs we do have a soft modification 6 node, which I can then click on. And there are a few options here that we can change. So for instance, the fall off radius, which we set in the options here for the soft modification tool, can then be interactively adjusted at this point. So if I click on the word fall off radius and then middle mouse button click and drag in my scene, you'll see that we can interactively scrub up and down that fall off radius. And if we're careful and select one of these other soft modification tools, we can then click on that in the channel box, and again click on the fall off radius, and then with our middle mouse button click and drag and update the fall off and control of that soft modification. Underneath the soft modification tool we have the show manipulator tool, and at first if we click on that it's not going to necessarily have an effect on a specific object. Let's just delete this sphere out of our scene. This show manipulator tool works for several different things and nodes and objects inside Maya. For instance, if I were to create a polygon light, just as an example, a light, directional light. When we create this directional light with the move tool, I can simply move it into place, and obviously with the rotate tool, rotate it, wherever I want. But if I click on the Show Manipulator tool, I'm going to get two manipulators. One is actually going to change the position of my light, and the other manipulator is essentially going to change the aim of my light. So this is just one example where we can use the Show Manipulator. We won't go into all the examples because there are just too many to name at this point, but you will see in several other tutorials that we are going to hit the Show Manipulator icon here. Now you'll notice that the last icon that I have in here is actually the Polysphere tool, and that's not always what you'll see in your scene. It just depends on what the last tool you used is. So for instance, if I click on a polygon cube, actually I'll delete that and then create polygon cube, but I'll turn on interactive creation and then click the polygon cube. So with interactive creation turned on, this was more of a command. And because I was using a command, you can see right here that we do have the polygon cube selected. So that is basically the last tool used icon. So let me give another example here. I'm going to click on a polysphere, create that. You'll notice that we get polysphere as the last tool used. If I right click and grab a few of the vertices there, and then we will do an extrude, you notice that that doesn't show up here. So some commands will show up as last tool used and other commands won't. If we did a merge edge command, you would see that show up. So it just depends on what specific command that you are using. So that's a quick run through of the toolbox. Just take a moment to create any specific object, and then I suggest that you familiarize yourself with the different options associated with each one of these tools.